The man who had planted a child inside her palm had just tried to erase it with a single gold coin. His name was Grant Holloway, ruler of Prosperity Creek, and she was June Calder, the woman he had dragged through the dust and discarded without mercy. Out on the high plains, the cast-off often noticed truths the powerful choose not to see. When June uncovered Holloway's savage plan to ambush an Apache family, she stood alone, pregnant, abandoned, and stripped of everything except choice. Would she surrender to the cruelty around her, or become something far more dangerous than they ever expected? The air of Prosperity Creek tasted of iron and deceit. June Calder felt it scrape her throat as she knelt in the street, jagged stones biting into her knees. Grant Holloway stood before her, a man as rigid and unyielding as the cliffs rising beyond town. His eyes never rested on her, only on the curious merchants and drifting onlookers gathering to watch. His vest was pristine, his boots gleamed, his expression carefully arranged into public disappointment. "Miss Calder," he said, his voice measured for the crowd, "I've made it clear, just as I've made it clear to this town, that your condition is the result of your own poor judgment, not mine." June's fingers shook as they pressed against the firm swell of her belly. 4 months. "Grant, please," she whispered, her words torn away by the ceaseless prairie wind. "You know exactly how things were," he snapped. "A room at the hotel. Nothing more." He paused, irritation flashing through his eyes. Until you could what?" His composure cracked for a heartbeat. What stared down at her wasn't a civic leader, but a man cornering an inconvenience. "You were compensated," he said coldly. "Paid well. This—" He reached into his coat as the crowd leaned forward. This was Grant Holloway, owner of the Holloway Mercantile and Land Office, the man holding debt over nearly every soul in town. He was engaged to Clara Whitmore, daughter of a St. Louis Railroad baron, a match that promised to transform Prosperity Creek from dust to destiny. From his pocket he produced not bills, but a single shining $20 gold piece. It caught the sun as it flew, landing in the dirt beside her hand. It was wealth. It was humiliation. "Take it," Grant ordered, his voice final. "Take that coin and catch the morning stage to Ogallala. There's a doctor there, Dr. Owen Hale, who can take care of your problem. Don't come back." The intent was mercilessly clear. He wasn't banishing her. He was demanding the end of the life inside her. The crowd murmured. A few women turned away, faces drained of color. June's tears vanished. Something sharp and cold cut through her despair. She stared at the coin, then up at the man who had whispered promises to her in lamplit rooms months before. She didn't touch the gold. Slowly, painfully, she rose. Her plain dress, the only one she owned, was streaked with street grime. She met his gaze. "Keep your blood money, Grant," she said softly. Her voice carried something new, unfamiliar. It was no longer the voice of a victim. It belonged to someone who had survived. She turned her back on him, on the coin, and on the judging eyes around her, walking away with each step fueled by pain and pride. She knew where she was headed. There was only one place left, a collapsing line shack miles beyond town. Sitting on the edge of Holloway's land, it was nothing but warped boards and a leaking roof hidden from the road by a sandstone rise. A refuge for castaways. A home of sorts. Passing the livery, she glimpsed Clara Whitmore stepping from the boardwalk's shade. Clara had avoided the spectacle, too refined for that. Her pale blue eyes followed June, cold as winter glass. She carried a lace parasol, pristine and white. She said nothing. A faint smile curved her lips. June kept moving. The sun burned down, and the child inside her fluttered a quiet reminder. She wasn't alone. That evening, as violet twilight swallowed the plains, June sat inside the shack, chewing stale hardtack. Beyond her window stretched a wide, barren valley no one bothered to graze. Too rocky, too exposed. But it offered a clear view. She watched 2 riders approach Grant Holloway's ranch in the distance. hard men dark against the dying light. One was massive, the other lean and restless. June saw Grant and Clara meet them on the veranda. That alone was strange. Clara never dealt with hired hands. The wiry man gestured toward the valley. June overlooked his movements, sharp with urgency. Grant passed him a heavy leather pouch. The man laughed, a coarse sound drifting on the wind. His name, though June didn't yet know it, was Cole Brant. He was no ranch hand. He was a tracker of men, a bounty hunter who made his living delivering people alive, usually for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. June Calder stood still and watched them ride away, not toward town, but deeper into the broken stone of the valley. Strapped to their saddles were odd, weighty bundles, too thick for rope, too rigid to be canvas. Nets, maybe, tightly wound and purpose-made. A cold ran through June, sharper than the coming night. Grant Holloway wasn't guarding his reputation anymore. He was setting something in motion, and he'd chosen the same day he tried to pay for the death of his own unborn child to do it. After that, time blurred into nothing but endurance. June's pregnancy, once a quiet, secret happiness, had become a public mark of disgrace and a constant physical weight. Her back burned. Her feet ballooned. Hunger gnawed at her, no matter how much she ate. But the rejection carved her into someone else. The gentle, hopeful girl had vanished. In her place stood a woman who watched the world with the still focus of a hunter. The line shack she'd been driven into barely kept out the weather. Wind slid through the twisted boards, moaning day and night like something grieving. Yet it had one mercy: no one came here. And from its cracked window June could see the valley and the faint trails threading through it. She survived by gathering what the land offered, just as her grandmother Martha Calder, a hard woman who had crossed the plains behind oxen, had taught her. June dug wild onions from dry soil, pulled bitter yarrow roots, and found gray man's root, the tuber her grandmother had warned her about. In small amounts, it calmed the restless. In larger ones, it ended breathing altogether. Sleep for the suffering, Martha used to say. Or sleep for the dead. The measure decides. June gathered a small bundle and laid it out on a sun-warmed stone to dry, unsure why. It felt necessary. That was all. Her searching eventually led her deep into the same valley where she'd seen Cole Brant and the others disappear. One dry afternoon, driven by thirst, she followed an empty creek bed until she found its hidden beginning, a narrow cut in the earth, a stone throat where clear water seeped from the rock and pooled before sinking back into sand. The air there was cool. Moss clung to the walls. Quiet pressed close. June named it the Whispering Grotto. It became her refuge and her secret source of clean water. She also discovered a narrow game trail, barely wide enough for a boot, zigzagging up the canyon wall to a high shelf overlooking the spring. The climb was dangerous, especially for her, but the view gave command over everything below. 7 days after she'd been cast out, June rested on that ledge, easing her aching spine, when voices drifted up from beneath her. She flattened herself against the stone, heart pounding. Grant Holloway's voice, Clara Whitmore's, and Cole Brant's. Ice flooded her veins. This was her place. The water's clean, Grant said, dipping a silver cup into the pool. Not much of it, but it never stops. It's enough. More than enough. Clara's reply cut sharp and bright. June dared to peer over the edge. Clara wore a practical split skirt, her cheeks flushed with excitement, not heat. She looked nothing like the sheltered St. Louis heiress. My father's engineers say the main aquifer runs right beneath this spring, Clara said. Tap it and you can water 10,000 head of cattle, or better yet, feed 1,000 steam engines. The railroad, Grant murmured, staring at the water like it was molten gold. The railroad, Clara confirmed. They'll put the main depot at Prosperity Creek. They'll crown you King Grant. Our land values will. He won't sell Cole Brant cut in spitting tobacco juice onto the moss. His voice scraped like stone. I told you. The Apache claim this grotto's sacred. That warrior Taku. He won't give it up, and he's not on the reservation. He's a renegade. June's breath caught. Taku. She'd heard the name murmured in town. An Apache warrior who refused confinement, who still hunted these lands with his family. Settlers called him a ghost, a danger. Then the land isn't yours, Clara said quietly. Dangerously so. Not while he's breathing, Cole Grant said. Your orders were simple. Drive him off. Kill him if you have to. And I told you, Cole growled. That's the problem. He's smart, knows this land better than I do. Better than my men. Amos Pike and Reed Talbot are capable. They're good, Cole admitted. But you can't track a shadow. And if we kill him, his people won't show you the other springs. You said he had to lead you to them. Silence fell. Only the trickle of water and the buzz of a fly filled the canyon. Then Clara Whitmore spoke. You're thinking wrong, Mr. Brandt, like a dull-handed butcher. Killing him gets us nothing. We need him breathing. Grant Holloway turned his gaze toward his fiancée. What are you proposing, Clara? He asked quietly. He has soft spots, doesn't he? Clara Whitmore replied. You told me he rides with his daughters. Brandt spat to the side. Yeah, 2 of them. Sella and Kimmy. They never leave him, Clara said. Which makes this intimate. Her voice carried no warmth at all. Grant exhaled slowly. Then the solution's clear. You're a hunter, Cole. You don't chase a wolf. You cage it. You said he comes here for water, Clara continued. That the place is sacred to him. He does, Brandt confirmed. Then this is where we spring the trap. Clara lifted her hand toward the canyon walls overhead. Those nets I had you buy in Cheyenne. We'll post your men along the ridges. When he steps into the grotto with his children, you release them. He'll be wrapped up before he can reach his blade. And he won't fight? Brandt muttered. Not with his daughters under threat, Clara replied. He'll stay alive. Cooperative. June Calder felt bile rise in her throat. She clamped a hand over her mouth. This wasn't about land anymore. This was abduction. And Clara, sweet, polished. Clara was the mind behind it all. Cole Brandt said at last. There was a rough edge of reluctant respect in his voice. I like it. And the girls, Grant asked. There are leverage, Clara answered calmly, as if discussing cattle. We keep them. He shows Grant the water. He signs the treaty. And afterward, Grant pressed. We release them, far away. And if he refuses? Clara turned to him. Her porcelain face showed no trace of mercy. Then you teach him, she said softly, how deeply a father can hurt. By watching, Grant Holloway, the same man who had ordered his unborn child erased, studied his fiancée for a long moment. Then he smiled. My dear Clara, he said, pleased, you're exceptional. I know, she replied. Now we write our letters. We're expected at the town social tonight. Reputation, Grant, it's everything. They walked away together. Cole Brandt remained behind his eyes, tracing the canyon walls, mapping the places where his men would lie in wait. June didn't move for nearly an hour. She was frozen on the ledge, her body trembling, sweat slicking her skin despite the heat. She was already an outcast, shamed, cut loose, erased. And the very people who'd done it, the so-called pillars of Prosperity Creek, were planning to break a man by threatening his children. At last she carefully climbed down the narrow game trail. Her thoughts spiraled. She had to warn him. But how? She didn't know the man. She didn't know where to find him. All she knew was where death waited. All she knew was the spring's name, the Whispering Grotto. 3 days passed. 3 days of tight, suffocating dread. June's world narrowed to the view outside her window. She watched Brandt's men ride in Amos Pike, broad and silent, and Reed Talbot twitchy and eager for blood. They hauled heavy, tar-coated nets and packs into the grotto. The trap was being built. June knew she couldn't stop them. She was one woman, pregnant, weak against armed men who answered to Grant Holloway. She considered going to the law, but Sheriff Frank Dyer lit his cigars with paper pulled from Grant Holloway's desk. There was no law in Prosperity Creek, only Grant. On the fourth morning, the air hung thick and heavy, charged with a storm that never came. June was gathering roots when she saw them. 3 riders in the distance, not following the trail, but moving through broken stone and scrub, flowing with the land instead of fighting it. 1 adult, 2 small children, Taku and his daughters. They were headed straight for the grotto. Panic hit June like a physical blow. She dropped everything and ran. Her stride was awkward, painful, one hand pressed hard against her side as a stitch tore through her ribs. She was too far away. She couldn't shout. They wouldn't hear her. And if they did, fear might drive them faster into the snare. She veered into a ravine, sliding down loose shale thorns, ripping at her dress and skin. There was only one chance, the overlook above the grotto. She clawed her way up the same game trail as before, lungs burning, legs shaking. The climb was brutal. Her pregnant belly felt like dead weight dragging her backward as the canyon rose around her. Twice her boots slid loose pebbles, skittering down into the canyon in a sharp cascade. June froze, breath locked in her chest, listening. Nothing answered. Cole Brandt's men were positioned on the higher ridges, just as Clara Whitmore had planned. The narrow game trail June used remained unseen. By the time she reached the shallow overlook, her lungs burned and her head swam with exhaustion. She dragged herself forward and peered down. They were already there. Taku stood tall in the heart of the sacred hollow, his presence commanding the small space. He wore buckskin leggings and a plain shirt, his long black hair bound back with leather. Every movement was precise, efficient, the economy of a seasoned Apache warrior. But when he looked at his daughters, his gaze softened. Selah, maybe 10 years old, and Kimi, no more than 6, were beautiful. They ran to the spring, laughing, their voices light and bright as they echoed off the stone walls. Selah carried herself with her father's quiet gravity. Kimi was all wonder, cupping water in her hands, splashing her sister delight, dancing in her eyes. Taku knelt beside the pool. He closed his eyes, dipped his hands into the spring, and lifted the water to his face. His lips moved in a silent prayer. The moment was fragile. Perfect. June's heart shattered. She wanted to scream, run, get out, but fate had already closed its fist. Cole Brandt's voice thundered from the opposite ridge. The sound that followed wasn't gunfire. It was a dull, brutal thump. Thump. Thump as weighted nets were hurled from above. They bloomed midair like massive black spiderwebs. Taku reacted instantly. He didn't reach for a weapon. He dove toward his daughters, shoving them behind him, throwing his own body over theirs. The first net slammed into him. Lead weights biting hard, forcing him to his knees. He roared pure fury and clawed at the tarred ropes. Then the second net fell. This one was aimed at the children. It wrapped around them, tangling tight, and Kimi's scream cut through the canyon, high, sharp, terrified. That sound broke Taku's focus. He turned from his own restraints, trying to reach his daughters, but the movement only dragged him deeper into the mesh. He stumbled, rolled, binding himself tighter in the coarse netting. Amos Pike and Reed Talbot slid down from their perches, boots skidding on loose shale, rifles raised. "Don't shoot," Brandt shouted. "Tie him down, grab the girls." Taku fought like a trapped grizzly. Even bound, he was terrifying. He forced himself to one knee, rope slicing into his arms, and managed to pull his knife free. He slashed, severing a main line. Amos Pike swung his rifle butt, cracking it hard against Taku's head. Taku staggered but stayed upright. He surged forward, slamming his shoulder into Amos's gut and sending the big man sprawling. Reed rushed in, but not at Taku. He seized the net, holding the girls, and dragged it away, the children tumbling inside like snared rabbits. Father Sela screamed. That was enough. Taku stopped fighting Brant and lunged for Reed. Brant struck him again with the rifle butt. Amos was back on his feet. All three men piled onto the Apache warrior, fists boots, and wood crashing down. From her ledge, June watched, paralyzed. Dust filled the air. Grunts echoed. Wood cracked against bone. She saw terror frozen in the little girl's eyes. Faces pressed into dirt. Hands wrenched and bound. It was over in minutes. Taku lay subdued, hog-tied atop the net. Blood streamed from a gash at his temple. His chest rose and fell, hard, but he made no sound. His eyes were locked on his daughter's, burning with a hatred so fierce June felt it from above. String him to that cottonwood, Brant ordered, panting. The girls, too. Separate, he added, where he can see them. The men hauled the captives like sacks of grain. They tied Taku upright against the tree arms, yanked painfully behind him. The girls were bound to a thinner sapling a few yards away. Kimmy sobbed quietly. Sela was silent, her small face rigid, carved with her father's defiance. Good, Brant said, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. Now we wait. Grant Holloway and his fine lady will be pleased. He stepped closer to Taku. You're going to give him what he wants, Warrior Brant said coldly. Or you're going to watch things get real ugly for those two. Taku didn't answer. He stared straight through Brant as if the man didn't exist. Amos Brant said, you take first watch. Reed, get a fire going. I'll sweep the perimeter. As the men settled in, June began to withdraw, slowly, carefully. Her entire body shook so badly, she could barely keep her grip on the rock. The memory of the little girl's cries still rang in June Calder's ears. She had seen herself in their faces. She had seen the fragile promise of her own unborn child reflected in their fear. She had watched Clara Whitmore, wealthy, polished, respected, orchestrate an act of cruelty beyond imagining. And she had watched Grant Holloway, the father of her child, give his approval with a satisfied smile. The so-called civilized world had cast her aside, and in doing so it had revealed what lay beneath its polish. Greed, hypocrisy, savagery. By the time June reached her shack, the sun was sinking, staining the sky in brutal reds and burning orange. The cold shard of numbness inside her had ignited into something fierce and unyielding. They believed she was nothing, a discarded woman, carrying an unwanted child. They were about to learn how badly they had misjudged her. The shack felt tight and airless. June paced the dirt floor, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. The image of the bound, sobbing children was seared into her mind. The dull crack of Amos Pike's rifle butt striking Taku's skull replayed again and again. She stopped, bracing herself against the rough planks, both hands pressed to her belly. The child inside her was still, as if sensing her turmoil. What am I supposed to do? She whispered into the empty room. The sensible answer was survival. Do nothing. She was one woman. They were three armed men. Cole Brant was a killer by reputation and by deed. Interfering meant death. She had her own life to protect, and the life growing inside her. She could vanish. Take what little she owned and walk until she found another town, another beginning, leaving Prosperity Creek and its horrors behind. But she couldn't. Grant Holloway's face rose in her mind. His rejection, his humiliation, the money he'd offered her to erase their child so he could preserve his name and his shining future with Clara Whitmore. And that future was being built on this moment, on the torment of a man and the terror of his children. She thought of Clara again, the cool smile, the lace parasol, the voice that discussed children the way men discussed railroad shares. June stared at her own hands, raw and cracked from digging roots out of stubborn earth. She was already an outcast, forced so far beyond the borders of polite society that its rules no longer bound her. They had mistaken her for something harmless, but she had been raised by Martha Calder, a woman who skinned her own deer and drove off wolves with fire and steel. The fear that had crippled June for weeks hardened into a single piercing resolve. This was not only about justice for Taku. It wasn't even about revenge on Grant. It was simpler than that. It was a mother protecting children, a human being refusing to let monsters prevail. She would free them. But how? She couldn't fight Cole Brandt and his men. She couldn't outshoot them. Her gaze swept across the meager contents of the shack, a bedroll, an empty burlap sack, a small hatchet for roots, a length of rope she'd scavenged, and on the flat stone by the window the dried, brittle pieces of gray man's root. Sleep for the troubled. A plan began to take shape. It was reckless. It was fragile. It depended on luck and timing and silence. But it was a plan. The hatchet was too loud, too brutal. June reached beneath her thin mattress and drew out her grandmother's skinning knife, a green river blade, dark with age but sharp enough to shave hair. She kept it honed out of habit. It was quiet. It would slice rope clean. She crushed the dried roots into a fine gray powder, working carefully. She poured it into a small water skin, adding a little water until it formed a thick, bitter concentrate. She gathered everything, the knife, the rope, the hatchet as a last resort, and the water skin. She knew the Whispering Grotto. She knew Cole Brandt's men. Arrogant, careless, confident in their power and their prisoners. They would not expect resistance. Certainly not from the wilderness itself. And never from a pregnant woman they believed broken and invisible. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. She also knew where they would draw their water. They wouldn't touch the sacred pool. They would fill their canteens and coffee pot upstream where the water ran fast and clear. She had seen Amos Pike head that way with 2 canteens just before she fled. That was her opening. She had to wait for full darkness. When the fire burned low and the first watch grew weary, June forced herself to eat the last of her hardtack. She needed strength. She wrapped her swollen feet in strips of cloth, padding them like makeshift moccasins to quiet her steps. She checked the knife, checked the rope. For a brief moment, the danger pressed in on her. If she were caught, Grant Holloway and Clara Whitmore would show no mercy. Cole Brandt would show none at all. What they would do to her child was beyond imagining. She shoved the thought aside. Fear had run its course. The sun slipped away, at last, drowning the plains. In moonless dark, the sky crowded thick with stars. A low wind rose whining through stone and scrub. It would hide the sound of her movement. June Calder braided her hair tight against her skull, severe and practical. She slid the knife into the waistband of her skirt, looped the rope over her shoulder, and tucked the heavy water skin into her pocket. Then she stepped out of the shack, not as the woman humiliated in the street, but as something unseen. She moved toward the Whispering Grotto, dissolving into shadow. The night felt alive. Wind moaned like a grieving animal, swallowing the soft crunch of June's feet against gravel. The moon was only a thin shard, just enough light to read the ground, not enough to give her away. The walk stretched nearly 2 miles each step, sending a sharp protest through her lower back. The child rode low and heavy, a constant ache reminding her what was at stake. She did not enter the grotto by its mouth. She circled wide from the north, angling for the hidden game trail that climbed toward her overlooked ledge. In darkness, the ascent was brutal. Her palms, raw from earlier climbs, clutched cold sandstone. She moved inch by inch, testing every hold before trusting it. Halfway up, a stone shifted beneath her foot. It rattled down the cliff face, a sharp cascade that sounded as loud as gunfire. June froze, flattening herself against the rock, her heart hammering wild. She held her breath. A voice drifted up from below. What was that, Reed Talbot? A grunt answered. Wind, or a coon. Shut up and drink your coffee. June released the breath she'd been holding in a silent, broken exhale. When the shaking eased, she climbed again. By the time she hauled herself onto the ledge, her body trembled with strain. She crawled to the rim and looked down. The canyon glowed with a single sputtering campfire. Cole Brandt lay asleep near the wall, wrapped in his blanket hat, pulled low over his face. Amos Pike and Reed Talbot kept watch by the fire, passing a bottle between them, their voices thick and careless. The coffee pot sat in the coals. 2 canteens lay near Amos's boots. Taku and his daughters were where she'd last seen them. The warrior remained bound to the tree head, slumped forward. He looked unconscious, maybe worse. The girls were tied together at the sapling. They were awake. In the firelight, June saw their pale faces, eyes wide and shining with terror. Her plan had been to poison a shared water barrel. There was none, only canteens. That meant getting closer. She waited. An hour dragged by, then another. The cold deepened, biting into her muscles until they cramped. At last Amos stood stretched and nudged Reed with his boot. "Your watch, you drunk." "I ain't drunk," Reed slurred, pushing himself upright. Amos rolled into his blanket on the far side of the fire and was snoring moments later. Reed made a poor sentry. He paced, jumpy, flinching at every gust. He wandered to the captives and kicked Taku's boot. "Hey, you still breathing?" Taku didn't move. Reed spat, returned to the fire, took another pull from the bottle, and dropped onto a rock rifle across his lap. "Now." June did not take the game trail. Too open. Instead, she moved along the ridge, past her overlook, to where the narrow stream slipped into the grotto before pooling. This was where they drew water. She unwound the rope, tied one end around a squat juniper, and looped the other beneath her arms and around her waist. She was no climber, but she had no choice. She eased herself over the edge. Her boots searched for shallow holes in the rock. 20 feet straight down. The rope bit into her palms as she lowered herself, slow, and scraping into darkness just above the camp. She dropped into the stream. The water was ice cold, a shock that burned through the rags on her feet. She stayed in deep shadow 30 yards upstream from the fire. She slipped the rope free and let it fall. There would be no climbing back. The only way out led straight through them. June uncorked the water skin. She moved downstream, staying in the water, each step soundless. She reached the bank where the men had filled their canteens. 2 lay there, caps on, abandoned by Amos. She rose from the stream, a shape among darker shapes, and crept forward. Reed Talbot sat by the fire, staring into the flames, humming a crooked drunken tune with no real melody. June Calder moved with a speed she didn't know she still had. She grabbed one of the canteens, twisted the cap loose, dumped in a heavy measure of the gray Maz root powder, splashed water from her own skin to thin it, then shook it once hard. She sealed it and set it back exactly where it had been. Then she treated the second canteen the same way. Her eyes went to the coffee pot resting near the fire, nearly full. Reed would drink that first. She pulled back into the stream, crouching behind a boulder as icy water soaked into her skirt and numbed her legs. She waited. Time stretched thin. Reed rose, stirred the fire with a stick, then just as she prayed, picked up the coffee pot. He poured himself a tin cup and drank. June's heart dropped. He hadn't touched the water. But then Reed grimaced, spat, and dumped the coffee onto the dirt. "Cold," he muttered. He glanced at the whiskey bottle, then shook his head like he was trying to clear it. He needed water. He turned and spotted the canteens. He grabbed the first one June had dosed, unscrewed the cap, and took a long, deep pull. June stopped breathing. Reed lowered the canteen, wiped his mouth, and stood there a moment. Then he drank again. The root was bitter, but the whiskey had dulled his tongue. He walked back to the fire, sat down, and set his rifle beside him. He yawned. June waited. The sedative worked fast, especially mixed with alcohol. Reed's head dipped. He jerked it up, tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He stared down at his boots, confused. Yawned again, wide and slow. This time his head didn't come back up. He slumped forward, breath deepening into a rough snore. He was out. June moved. She slipped from the stream, her grandmother, Martha Calder's knife tight in her grip. She passed Reed without a sound, eyes flicking to the other two men. Cole Brandt and Amos Pike were still dead asleep. She reached the captives and went to the girls first. Kimmy whimpered as June's shadow crossed her. Selah lashed out with her bound feet. "Shh," June whispered, finger to her lips. "I'm here to help." She showed them the knife. She cut through the ropes tying them to the sapling, then the bindings on their wrists and ankles. The coarse fibers fell away. "Don't move," June murmured. "Wait for your father." She turned to Taku. He had never been asleep. His eyes were open narrow, burning slits in the dark. He had watched everything: the poisoning, the waiting, the timing. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her belly. June met his gaze. No words were needed. She placed a hand over the curve of her child, a simple truth offered plainly. "I am a mother. I am not your enemy." She moved behind the cottonwood and began sawing at the thick ropes biting into his wrists. They were cinched cruelly tight. The blade was sharp, but the work was slow. Her arms burned. She heard Cole Brandt shift in his sleep. At last the final strand snapped. Taku didn't move at first. Then with a low groan, he rolled his shoulders, blood rushing back into his arms. June stepped around him and cut the ropes at his ankles, then sliced through the net. He was free. The instant the net fell away, Taku rose to his feet. Gone was the beaten captive from earlier. This was a warrior awake in an enemy camp. June staggered back, fear flashing sharp and sudden. He was tall, powerful, newly freed. He could kill her and vanish into the night. He didn't even glance at her. His first move was toward his daughters. He crossed the distance in 2 silent strides, pulling them into his chest, hands sweeping over their hair, their faces murmuring to them in Apache, soft, steady words of comfort and love. June's throat tightened. Selah pointed toward the sleeping men. "Father, we must hush," Taku said quietly, his eyes lifted, measuring the camp, the 3 sleeping men, and the night that still held its breath. By the rifles stacked against a rock, June Calder watched, barely breathing. This was the moment vengeance was supposed to come, the place where the savage, as Clara Whitmore had named him, would claim blood for blood. Taku stepped toward Cole Brandt. He lifted Brandt's heavy rifle, testing its weight in his hands. Brandt, sunk deep in a drugged sleep, didn't stir. Taku studied the man's face, the man who had ordered his capture, his expression flat, unfeeling. He raised the rifle. June clamped a hand over her mouth. He didn't swing it. Instead, with calm precision, he worked the lever, silently ejecting the cartridges, one by one, catching each round before it struck stone. He repeated the motion with Amos Pike's rifle, then Reed Talbot's. All 3 weapons were emptied. He stripped the ammunition pouch from Brandt's gun belt. Then with deliberate care, he laid the rifles across a boulder. Using Brandt's own rifle as leverage, he snapped the wooden stocks of the other 2, not destroying them outright, but breaking them badly enough to make them obsolete for a long while. It was a clean victory. No blood. He was stranding them. Taku gathered the canteens, every one of them, including the 2 June had poisoned. He would empty them later. He took the jerky, the hardtack, and the nearly full bottle of whiskey. Then he turned to June. She stood near the cottonwood, shaking from cold and adrenaline. For a long moment neither spoke. Wind whipped her wet skirt against her legs. He noticed the raw scrapes on her hands, the exhaustion carved into her face, the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy. He saw an outcast, just like himself. He stepped toward her. June flinched. He stopped. His voice came low, rough, barely above the wind. "You are Pinksa," he said. He searched for the word. "Brave. You bleed." He gestured to her torn hands, then to the gash on his own temple. "He Grant Holloway." June whispered, not knowing why she felt the need to explain. "He did this. He wants the water. He's..." The father of my child. He cast me out. Taku's dark eyes held hers. Something passed between them, understanding and a shared bitter contempt for the so-called civilized men sleeping at their feet. He knew who Grant Holloway was. Taku lifted his hand, not in warning but open-palmed. He touched his chest then gestured to her belly. It wasn't a threat. It was respect. A blessing. Father Sela urged softly, tugging at his hand. Taku nodded. He gave June one final look, acknowledging a debt that would never be spoken. Then Sela, quiet and steady until now, did something unexpected. She ran to June. She was so quick, June barely reacted. The girl pressed something small, warm, and solid into June's hand, closing her cold fingers around it. For you, Sela whispered, her English flawless. For life. Then she was gone, back at her father's side. Taku lifted Kimi onto his hip. He took Sela's hand. Without looking back, the three of them slipped into the deep shadows of the grotto, moving up the canyon, fading away as if they'd never been real. June stood alone. She looked down at her hand. Resting in her palm was a small beaded amulet, sinew woven with blue and white beads, a single sharp hawk's talon tied at the bottom. A groan rose from the fire. Cole Brandt. He was stirring. The sedative had been strong, but Brandt was stronger. Or maybe she hadn't managed enough in his canteen. Panic, cold, and absolute flooded her. She had no plan for this. She turned and ran. She fled through the main mouth of the grotto and out into the open valley, never looking back. Her breath tore from her chest as she ran, clutching the amulet tight in her fist. June didn't know how she made it back to the shack. The 2-mile run dissolved into stumbling, falling, dragging herself upright again. Pain flared white-hot across her back and sharp cramps knifed through her belly. She collapsed through the doorway just as the first sickly gray light of dawn stained the eastern sky. She was empty. She lay on the dirt floor, gasping, body trembling beyond control. She had done it. They were free, and yet deep in her bones she knew it wasn't finished. The sun was already high when she heard the horses. Not the steady rhythm of a lone rider, but the furious, reckless thunder of many mounts driven too hard. June pulled herself to the window. She saw Grant Holloway, Clara Whitmore, Sheriff Frank Dyer. They were riding hard from the direction of the grotto straight toward the ranch, and beside them rode Cole Brandt, swaying with rage. Amos Pike and Reed Talbot were nowhere in sight, left behind, likely sick, weaponless, and useless. Even from a distance, June could read the fury in Grant Holloway's body. He lashed his horse with the riding crop, striking again and again. Clara Whitmore rode stiff-backed beside him, her posture flawless, her face carved from ice. They knew. June's eyes dropped to the coat hanging from a nail by the wall, the one she had worn the night before. The top pearl button was gone. She remembered it snagging on a branch as she fled the grotto. She didn't have long to wait. One rider broke from the group and charged toward the shack, hooves pounding like a warning drum. Grant Holloway did not knock. He kicked the door open, the warped wood splintering on its hinges. He filled the doorway, face blotched red with rage. His tailored suit was smeared with dust, his hair loose and wild. The careful mask of respectability was gone. "You," he snarled. The word landed like a verdict. He stormed inside his presence, crushing the small room. He saw her on the floor, exhausted, filthy breathing, yet hardened but alive. "Where are they?" he bellowed, seizing her arm and yanking her upright. The sudden motion sent the world spinning. June cried out, clutching her belly. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, June," he shouted, his face inches from hers. "Don't you dare lie." He shoved his fist toward her. In his palm lay the pearl button. "Cole Brandt found this," he hissed. "It came off your coat. You did this. You let him go. You destroyed everything." June stared at the button, then at his twisted, furious face. And the fear was gone. The fire that had hardened inside her the night before still burned. She was no longer the woman he had humiliated in the street. "Yes," she said. Her voice was soft but sharp enough to cut him. "I did." Grant froze, stunned. He actually stepped back. You admit it." His voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've cost me a fortune. You sided with savages against your own kind. My kind." June let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Are you my kind, Grant? The man who tried to pay me to carve his own child out of my body?" She turned her head toward the ridge where Clara Whitmore now sat watching, distant and elegant. "Is she my kind?" June went on. "The woman who planned to break a man by hurting his children? Is that what you call civilization? You'll hang for this." Grant whispered, his rage turning cold. "I'll tell Sheriff Frank Dyer you're an Apache lover, a traitor who helped a renegade escape. They'll tear you apart. And you'll tell them why." June stepped toward him. For the first time he retreated. "Go on," she said. "Tell Sheriff Dyer everything. Tell him you and Charles Whitmore hired Cole Brandt to kidnap a man. Tell him you planned to use his daughters to steal his land." She advanced again, eyes blazing. "Tell them how you failed. Tell them how the pregnant woman you cast into the dirt outwitted 3 armed men with nothing but a root she dug from the ground. Tell them she said. Tell Prosperity Creek exactly who their great benefactor really is." Grant stared at her. He saw no fear, no remorse, only a woman with nothing left to lose, and that terrified him more than any gun. His life was built on reputation, on the illusion of progress and virtue. She could shatter it, not with violence, with truth. "You're a monster," he breathed. "You made me one," June replied. "You cast me out. You thought I'd crawl away and die." She opened her hand. The beaded amulet lay in her palm, strung with a sharp hawk talon. "They're gone, Grant," she said. "They're not on your land. They're not on any land you'll ever find. You lost." Grant looked at the amulet, at her face, at the unyielding strength in her eyes. With a strangled sound of helpless rage, he turned and stormed out. He tore his horse's reins free, mounted hard, and drove his spurs in without mercy. He rode back to his furious fiancée, a defeated man. June Calder stood in the doorway of the broken shack, watching them until they faded into dust. She was still poor. She was still an outcast. She was still pregnant. The cramping in her belly sharpened, tightening with each breath, and a new fear, raw and physical, began to rise. The fight for her own life and for the life growing inside her was not finished, but she was free. June Calder closed her fingers around the amulet, the hawk's talon biting into her palm, a mark of the bond forged in darkness. She had saved a family, and in doing so she had finally terrifyingly saved herself. June Calder's story ends there in the dust and wind of the high plains. She was a woman, cast aside, who found her strength not in civilization, but in standing against it. She proved that courage isn't measured by the gun at your hip, but by the lines you refuse to cross and the ones you dare to. The West was filled with silent heroes like June, outcasts, survivors, people whose names were never carved into stone, but whose choices shifted lives, one quiet act of defiance at a time. If June's story of survival and quiet strength moved you, we invite you to show your support. Leave a like, share this story with someone who loves a true Western drama, and subscribe so you don't miss more forgotten legends and hidden histories of the Wild West. Thank you for listening. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.